Hey, what's good, family? I've had a great day so far. Really happy to put this video out finally. It's been a long time coming, and there have been a lot of questions regarding frequency splitting that we all kind of want to know. Now, before I go on, I just kind of want you guys to know that frequency splitting is something that I understand the mechanics of, but it isn't something that I do anymore. It's not to say that you shouldn't, but with all of the new features from a lot of synthesizers that have been coming out, you kind of have the option to signal split, which is a very similar process to frequency splitting, which we'll also cover, but I just don't do it anymore. I was looking up a Reddit thing about Cohen Sound right after I put out last week's video, and apparently they still do frequency splitting, and it's a big part of their bass design process. So while the stuff that I'm going to create today is probably not going to sound anything like it because we're going to do it from scratch, hopefully this video will kind of guide you through showing you how you can get closer. Thing is, like, the reason why I don't do it anymore is because it's kind of a tedious process, and there is a lot more that, I have my own workflow that makes it a lot easier for me to achieve these kinds of narrow basses without doing frequency splitting. But the trade-off is that maybe my sounds aren't nearly as clean, and it could be a mixing issue compared to other people's music. I don't really know, but it's not to say that it's something that should necessarily be overlooked. So let's jump right in. So what is frequency splitting? Well, I'm going to pull up a multiband, and we're just going to kind of look at a frequency spectrum and kind of get a general idea. So frequency ranges from 0 all the way to 20K, which is like the highest notable audio processing that a computer does, or at least kind of has a visual for. And what this basically means is that we have our low frequencies, that would be like our bass regions, all the way up to our high end, which would usually end up in our hi-hats or white noise type area. The middle is kind of like our mid-range basses, so that's where you'll get all of your neurotones. Keep that in mind when you're designing this kind of stuff. But when we talk about frequency splitting, most of the time you have a low, mid, and high band. Whenever you're doing bass design, 9 times out of 10 you're going to leave the sub alone, if only maybe give it a little bit of saturation. Most of the work is going to be done in the mid-range, and then you can kind of do a lot more, or you can kind of experiment with your high end, because that can always be low passed, or this is kind of where you can play. So how does this translate into being able to process each band individually? On FabFilter products like this and also ProQ, you can make separate bands to where you can do individual processing, but you can't create chains. So in order to fix that, what we're going to do is, I'm going to go in here because I have one pre-made already. So what I have here is a Dynamics for Drums rack that I made a long time ago that I don't actually use anymore, but that's not really important. This is just a name. So what I have here are 3 different chains within this group rack that is soloed with the multiband dynamics of high, middle, and low. If we're going to make this from scratch, what we want to do is we can use a multiband dynamics, or we can also use an EQ3 or anything that has a solo on it. For the sake of consistency, I'm just going to use a multiband dynamics. So we would go into our audio effect and pull this up, and we're going to hit group. Command G if you're on a Mac, Control G, hopefully that's correct. If we go to this like menu layout or a list layout, you'll see that there's only one signal that's being processed. And this right here is where I want to talk about the difference between signal processing, signal splitting and frequency splitting. So right here, if I were to duplicate this, then now we have 2 signals that are the exact same, but has all of the frequency content within this within these 2 chains. Does that make sense? So both of these are the exact same, but they're both being played at the same time. It's kind of like a fork in the road, so to speak. The only difference is isolation of frequencies. So we would create a 3rd chain, whereas we would solo the top, solo the middle, and solo the bass. And just to make this clear, we have our high, we have our low. It's not how you spell low, leave me alone. That's mid. And then we have our low, just to be cool. Yeah. All right. So what this basically means is if I were to solo this and play a note, here's our highs, here's our mids, here's our lows. Something that I want you guys to keep in mind is that on the multiband dynamics, you have the high and low frequency. So anything above 2.5K would be considered a high frequency, and anything below 120 hertz would be considered our low frequency. So if you kind of want to tune that, as opposed to going and adjusting each one, let's just say I want to mess with this and I want to say, all right, I want our highs to actually be everything above 2K, and then I want our lows to be everything below 160. Then I would go and create my duplicates mid-low. Notice I renamed that and spelled it correctly. I love colors. Colors are nice. Okay, so how does one go about processing this? And this is kind of where everything that I talked about from all of the other videos that I've done, if you've potentially seen any of my other bass videos of how you process, and to be honest, it's kind of the same thing. It's just where you put things. So we have EQ, we have distortion, we have effects, filtering, all that stuff. But it's just kind of putting it on the individual tracks in order to kind of come up with something that is clean. So what I'm going to do is just start with our lows and listen to how this sounds if I play an F. Actually, hold on. Let's listen to our source sound, and I'll cover this patch super quickly. It's just a Reese, and if I turn this up, you guys know that sound. There's a little bit of distortion here. I'm not going to really talk about this other than the fact that this is not doing anything. And on the high band here, I've turned up the highs because if I were to turn this off, then this is cutting off all the high frequencies. So in order to bring it back, I'm using the multiband compressor to kind of give it that nice crunchy sound. On our EQ, there is some light fletching happening, and then we are scooping the low mids for a classic Reese sound. And this is going to kind of play a part whenever you're doing pitch bending, because the sub at 2 octaves higher has a very prominent tone versus hopefully you can hear that woo, and we don't want that. So that is why I've done that. And then from here we can kind of continue. Starting with the lows, generally you don't do a whole lot to it. So we can experiment if we want to, but now that we can solo this, we can kind of listen to how it sounds. Oops, what I need to do is go back and make sure that the proper things are soloed. My bad. Okay, so this is what our sub sounds like. And the only thing that I would maybe consider doing is, at the most, adding a touch of saturation. If you put this on a soft sine, then it will kind of already do that for you. So listen to this in analog. Now listen to this in soft. It's already beefier. Make sure that's turned on, and then maybe turn that down like that. And the only other thing that I might want to do with the low frequencies is make sure that the bass is in mono. So now that's nice and consistent and sitting in the middle of our stereo spectrum. With our mids, we have, and this is going to be the most like experimental place in my opinion, because this is where all of the vocal tones happen, and this is kind of where we can experiment and actually just like destroy this if we really wanted to. So let's do that. All right, I want this to sound like blown out, so we are going to add some saturation. Let's find trash 2. Here we are, and let's listen to how this sounds. Nice and crunchy. Cool. And then there are some things that I really like hearing in this, so I'm actually going to see what happens if I throw an amp. So we're doing double distortion.
No, it cannot be!
Let's put this in dual. Turn this down by quite a bit. And right now I'm just kind of shaping tones and just kind of playing with what I can potentially do with our mid-range. I'm not worried about how it sounds with the rest of everything right now. This is just focused on its own. Okay, there's that top end that's kind of like crunchy. All right. From here, let's go ahead and start playing with some filters. And we will generally start off with a notch. I might even use 2 if I'm feeling dastardly. So let's sweep this spectrum and see how it sounds. Okay, so right here is good. Let's turn the envelope all the way up. And we are going to turn this rate to something that's a little bit more consistent. That sounds pretty good. And what I might do is actually add in an auto filter before this and do something similar. So something to keep in mind is that if you use a band pass, then you're going to cut out everything pretty much. So if you're going to do that, then you might want to do a signal split here where you group this and then create a separate chain like this, where you create a chain that has kind of that same thing. And this is kind of where you can throw this and keep this here and then maybe turn this down to process it on its own, which sounds pretty cool. Maybe I'll just do a little bit here and then start from there. And what I'm kind of doing here is trying to be mindful about where the sweet spot is for these frequencies, because if I play this up here and I solo this, you don't really hear a whole lot. But as you go down towards that low mid, kind of like in between 200 and 800 hertz, it's kind of where that sweet spot is. So I'm going to leave the amount right there and then kind of turn up the rate. And this is kind of like where we're going with this, is really it's just kind of seeing how many different ways that you can split this up and individualize and make the sound more complex without necessarily blowing it out. Does that make sense? And then maybe on this one, I'm actually going to try a phaser. And I know that some of you guys don't have the most powerful computer, so we'll talk about doing this in audio here in a second, but just bear with me and just kind of hold your horses until I get there. So right now we're messing with the mid band, and we have a signal split with the band pass just to kind of make sure that everyone's caught up. And we're trying to just accent this just a little bit more, and then maybe add a little bit of distortion to bring that back out. So I'm actually going to choose an overdrive for this because I know what an overdrive sounds like, and I think it's going to work very well. So let's kind of like recap how this sounds. Now, honestly, you can't really tell a big difference, so that means that we have a lot more work to do, but this is kind of the process of like just a way that you can continue to make everything sound crazier and super like organic or whatever, because you have a bunch of things that are moving around at once, if that makes sense. And then maybe on this one we can actually add in another notch. And it's kind of cool because when you do chain splitting, or when you do, signal splitting, you are basically able to maintain or preserve certain qualities of that mid-range, and together they kind of add everything up so that way you can kind of keep doing more things to it. That sounds really confusing, I imagine, but if you can kind of see how this goes, like even though I've done a bunch of processing on here, it hasn't really affected the overall sound too much. So it allows a little bit more creativity and allows you to kind of crank different things that you may or may not like. That's kind of where we're at on this. And let's just see how this sounds with a pitch bend. Okay, so some of the filters are starting to move a little bit more now, which is very nice. And what I'm going to do is add in a flanger because I am making creative choices and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I do not care. All right, so turn the feedback down on this. There you go. It's kind of weird. Like when I first had this, I could not get that jet sound, but just turning the feedback down kind of gives it a more desirable sound. And then I might actually make this a little bit slower. There we go. And then let's kind of balance this out with a little bit more saturation and see how our mid-range sounds after this. So again, I know that I'm making a lot of like decisions and I'm kind of like trying to talk and listen to how the sound is in its own right. But again, the entire point of this video is to just show you like the process of how you can go about doing frequency splitting and why and whatever. Maybe I will turn the amount back up all the way. And what I would like is for this to kind of stay up in that higher region. Okay, so altogether we have, now we can tell that our mid-range is way too loud, so we can individually go down and then tune this, or sorry, turn the volume down on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to play both of these because that's where all the mud is. I think that's good. And then so you can kind of hear between that, like even though the re still has preserved its original character, there's a lot of twisting that's happening within that mid-range there. Let's go ahead and solo this to listen to how it sounds. Which sounds pretty neat. So that's kind of that. I am actually going to keep doing this with another notch because I want to make this a little bit more prominent, and I actually want to cut more of the sound out to make it twist more. So did you guys notice that like moving this up this frequency spectrum kind of started cutting more of the sounds that I was looking for? Well, I know that you didn't know what I was looking for, but kind of like paying attention to how the sound is on its own right is very important, because if I left this in the low region, then it wasn't cutting anything and it was basically doing nothing. But pushing this up a little bit, now we're kind of getting somewhere that is a little bit more desirable. And I can add in a little bit more there, and let's listen to how that sounds over the whole thing. Okay, so that's kind of our mid-range section, so to speak, if we wanted to do that. And then we can also kind of play with the arrangement of this. So if I wanted everything to move over, maybe on this I actually want to, let me see how this sounds. Okay, that's because I'm still playing the whole sound. Sorry. Okay, I think that is a good place. And there we go. So now we can move on to our highs, which will kind of just be the same process again of kind of moving on with this. And I am going to keep going, but this would be a great time to kind of pause, because if this is all that you were looking for, this is pretty much the extent of the video when in regards to doing processing with effects. So the same thing can happen if your CPU isn't as good. I am going to come back to this, but what you can also do is just bounce out a long note of the original sound. So I can set up a resampling channel, set this to record, and then what I would do is duplicate this 3 times, and then this would be our highs, this would be our low, our mids, and this would be our lows, and then we would process them the exact same way. But we can freeze these individually or mix and match them or whatever, and then bounce them back all into one sound, which is kind of the classic way to do it. But because technology has advanced so much, it kind of has allowed us to do things very complex like in this manner. So kind of recapping what I'm doing is, you know, generally we have our process of adding distortion or adding harmonics to it, and then finding different ways to cut the sound out and give it some more character, and then kind of like move everything. Well, really, we're just doing stuff. Yeah, yeah. So distortion, effects, EQ, all that good stuff, and it's really just kind of playing with the ingredients and not necessarily worrying about the, you know, there's a lot of room for interpretation, so to speak. So let's go ahead and work on our highs now, and then we'll see if we can make this a little bit more interesting, and maybe we can process the overall thing at the end to kind of make it more interesting. So here we are with our highs. They're nice and crunchy already, so I don't know if I want to add too much distortion to them. So what I will start doing is actually just filtering. And I'm going to actually use a high pass, I think, just for the sake of being different. There we go. And then something that you might want to be mindful of is kind of keeping in mind of the rates, because if everything is at a different rate, then it's going to affect the sound in a different way, and that may or may not be desirable for you. So just kind of keep that in mind. So if I were to play this with this, that sounds pretty cool already, actually. And on, like I said before, on the high end, you really don't have to do a whole lot. And even with the mids, I really didn't have to go in depth and do this much processing. You can really just kind of take a bandpass and then add some distortion to it or whatever, but sometimes people make really complex basses like this and they come up with some good stuff, but again, it's kind of up to you. Generally, like this, what I've done on already, I can just apply it to the entire overall sound and then still have something that sounds decent. And I might even, you know what, I might even come back to that later just to kind of show you the differences of frequency splitting versus doing it this way. So let me turn everything off on this. That way my computer does not crash. And let's kind of maybe just add in a couple of extra things to this. Okay, I might actually add some chorus onto this. So if you guys don't know already, I'm a big fan of the Native Instruments stereo effects, the chorus flanger and the phaser, because they all just sound absolutely fantastic, in my opinion. But this is a little bit much, so ease that out a bit. Maybe what we can do now is play with a little bit of reverb. And this is cool because, you know, I'm only going to be applying reverb to the top end of this. So everything else will still have a relatively dry signal. So that's a Pro Q. I need a Pro R. All right. So we're here. And I'm not going to worry about doing any EQing on this because this is just on the high end. So I can leave this at whatever. That sounds kind of cool. And we can make this have a lot more stereo up in this high end because, again, we're not worried about spreading our mids too far. Does that make sense? Okay, neat. So now we have a little bit of stereo in with some movement on the top. We have tons of movement happening in the original. And then we have a solid sub that is it's going to be very consistent. But I might want to turn that down a bit. So let's listen to how the whole thing sounds. And now I have a twisting bass that has a little bit too much reverb on the top end. And so that's just kind of something that you're going to have to, you know, that sounds a little better, I think. Let's try this again. So there you have it. Frequency splitting in a nutshell, but the bass itself isn't done. So just because you do everything with individual bands doesn't mean that you doesn't mean that you just set it and leave it. So what I would do from here is try to find some consistency within the sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this and then duplicate this because that's the finished product. And then just keep that here and do this. And yes, so the overall processing, what I'm going to do is throw on an EQ and just kind of look at what is happening. So there's no peaks except for a little bit here. So I'm going to try to just tame that a little bit. And then I want to listen to this region here because that's kind of our real Roy. So I might boost that just a little bit. But as you can tell, the sound is relatively flat. So it's not flat when it's all playing at once, but what I mean is that there's nothing that is peaking over this yellow bar. So we're kind of in an okay region right now. So maybe something that I might experiment with is, and it's not that I have to do this, but I'm going to just kind of see what this sounds like with an OTT. Sounds pretty cool. Then from here, now that our overall sound is processed, we can do more filtering, we can do whatever, but it doesn't really matter as long as it sounds okay, if that makes sense. If I want to overdo it, I can add in a different kind of multiband. I don't know why, but for some reason, I like keeping this OTT as this, and then I like using multiband for like, the FabFilter MB for more creative things. So on this, you can turn the compression down, or turn the threshold down, and then try to keep that from moving too much. Top end. So I basically turned everything up, but still kind of flattened the sound out a little bit. And sometimes that's important because you might have a lot of dynamics in your bass, and that may or may not be a desirable thing. So using a multiband compressor can sometimes help level everything out. And that's not necessarily necessary in this case because we can already say that there's no peaking happening with the Pro Q3. But I'm just kind of showing you options from here. This is like an explorative video as opposed to I've already made this for the sake of efficiency. Because, again, you never know what you're going to get. So that's kind of one of those things. Okay, so something else that I want to talk about is while I do like the overall nature of how it sounds right now, I feel like it's not doing, it's not cutting enough or it's not moving enough. So, which is kind of weird because it has a lot of filters in it. So what we can do is a signal split now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to throw in another auto filter and we're going to group this and do the same thing that we did with our midband. So we'll go here and we'll keep this in a bandpass. This will just be a clean signal, and I'm just going to turn this down by quite a bit. So there we go. And then maybe I'll drive this a little bit. Cool. So as you can tell, I've cut out quite a bit of the sound, and then we are preserving, let me delete that for visual. This is the original signal. And then this is just adding an extra filter movement without taking away too much, so it still helps balance it out. But because this is set to here, it's a lot more quiet, as you can see here as well. So what I'm going to do is just throw in my saturator and kind of bring that back up a little bit. Maybe I will turn down lows just a little bit. And let's listen to how that sounds with a pitch bend. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, but to be fair, there is some mid-range mud whenever you do that pitch bending. So what I'm going to do is go into this, and I'm actually going to dip this a little bit more. This is going to be a long video. Holy cow. That sounds pretty awesome, to be honest. So yeah, now that we kind of have this template or whatever, we can leave that as it is and save that as a group. We can also go in and change this into something like a square. Right? Okay, so the phasing relationship is a little bit different between a saw and a sine, so you might have to go back and kind of mess with this a little bit. It's not phasing the way that I want it to. That's a little bit better. There we go. So we have that. We can also do it from the sine wave if we wanted to. Which might be a better option. And then this makes the noise a little bit more prominent, so be mindful of that. So we have a bunch of different options just from exploring the different kinds of waves that you can make. And now that we have this rack, which I will probably leave this project file on my Patreon, you guys will have a deeper understanding about how to get kind of a cleaner sound. But it doesn't end there. So I'm going to go back to the saw wave. Turn this back down. And I am just going to bounce this out into audio. So let's duplicate that. And now we have this really cool audio waveform that has a lot to it. So we can throw this in a sampler and then further process it however we wish. But what I want to do is just listen to how this sounds whenever we do our classic thing that I covered in the last video. So I'm going to turn that off and then solo this and then make sure that the source sound is the correct root note. Turn this up. That's cool. And now we have this really neat monster sound that we can continue to filter and add effects or whatever it is that you want to do. So just for the sake of kind of demonstration, we can do a morph filter with this. And then we'll go into our modulation. And we're going to probably do the filter on this and turn down the here. And then on this one, we are going to go from A and just find the morph. So filter morph. There we go. Here we go. Turn this up a little bit. And then we can again mess with that transposition to see if we can find something else that's interesting. So maybe I won't do the filter so much. There we go. And then I can go back and mess with this pitch again. And then it's just kind of a matter of messing with this and finding something that sounds kind of interesting. Oh, that kind of puts it in both, so I don't want to do that. And you can kind of see how far the rabbit hole goes from there. There's a lot to it. I wish that there was a mix function right here because that would make things a lot easier to hear. And that is a nutshell of how you do frequency splitting. But this video is not over. I still have more to explain. So feel free to grab a drink or something before we go on into the next part, which I'm going to talk about why I do not do frequency splitting. And here we go. My feet are asleep. Okay, well, that is all nice and dandy. And while I do think that it's really fun to experiment that way, a lot of synths these days have kind of similar features that allow you to do things within the synth themselves. So in Serum, while we might not necessarily be able to do exact frequency splitting, we might not have as in-depth control as we might want in that field, there's a lot of things that we can use that will split the signal in order to allow us a similar field of control. For example, just the fact that we have 3 oscillators means that we have a kind of means to control our frequency range. So if I wanted to create a full sound, then I can have a sub, I can have a mid right here, and then on the third, I can also have a higher octave. So whenever I play this, then I kind of get something in that field. And then if I wanted to, I can kind of automate or mess with the levels between these to kind of control the nature of the sound in itself. That is one version of doing a form of signal splitting. To kind of further accentuate that, if I'm using a filter, we also have a mix function. So if I have the mix all the way up, sorry, this needs to be on all of those, but I want to preserve a different part of the sound, I can actually automate the mix. And this becomes incredibly important whenever you're doing like a full range sound like this, or you're doing something that regards a bandpass, because a bandpass generally cuts out so much of the sound. So to kind of counter that, let's say I'm doing something that I classically do quite a bit, which is a multi with a band and a notch, then I can automate the cutoff of the band. I can automate the cutoff of the notch. And I'm like, don't worry about how this sounds. I'm just kind of showing you for mechanics' sake. But because that's cutting out so much of the sound, I can adjust the mix. And now I have a little bit more of a feel for, I have a little bit more control in its own right. So that in itself, while it's not frequency splitting exact, is still something that you can keep in mind whenever you're designing sounds. Something on a much more simple level that a lot of effects within Ableton have is if I pull up a chorus, you'll notice that there is a high pass here. And that means that you're able to still control the sound because anything below 1K is not going to be affected by the chorus. Furthermore, if you are doing distortion and you have something like trash, then trash offers a multi-band feature here, and multiband here, where you can process and add distortion to these on an individual level. So while it's not exactly the same, and the depth of control isn't quite there, I feel like whenever I use plugin synths in themselves, it's enough to suffice making a sound that I desire. In the case of how does everything sound if you don't do frequency splitting, let's go ahead and hear how all of this sounds. So I'm going to take everything from our mid region here and move it outside of the box. Place that right here. Okay, so because this is a high pass, it's going to take out a little too much. So that is something I'll have to be mindful of, and I'm not going to put that in the original chain. But because for the most part these are all notches and bandpass splits, I think that we should be okay. So if I wanted to, I can turn this off as well, just for the sake of being consistent. And I will leave the saturation and the bass mono on here. Actually, no, what I'm going to do is move this. Whoa, what happened? Oh, okay. Let's move this and turn the reverb off. Okay. Sorry, I'm just making sure that this is all supposed to be in the right place. Multiband dynamics.
But where is my OTT?
It's okay. So what I've done is basically just moved everything from the mid region and moved it outside here. So the last thing I'm going to do is put an OTT on the outside, and let's listen to how this sounds. Not that one. Versus so question, can you tell the difference? We just had a Dora the Explorer moment. Yes, I can tell the difference. The one on the bottom isn't nearly as clean, but it still has a similar characteristic to this, and that's something that I can potentially work with. So let me actually move this and give it a different color. That way we know what the difference is between the two. So we have this one. And this one definitely sounds more phasey and chorusy. So that's something to keep in mind about why you may or may not want a frequency split. But also when you're doing sound design, you can also keep in mind that a lot of synths and effects have features that allow you to maybe not frequency split, but signal split to create chains. So that was a very in-depth, but I cannot call this comprehensive because there's still so much more to be learned on my end about this kind of stuff. But hopefully this video, as in-depth as it is, will become useful in all of your endeavors of sounding or making bass. But one more thing that I want to leave you with is that you don't have to just do this stuff on bass. You can do this on any other thing. You can do this with drums. You can do this with synths. You can do this with pads. It's all kind of about how you perceive it. One final thing that I want you to keep in mind is that if you make a really sick rack, kind of like this,
Save it.
So I'm going to save the project file, and we're going to name this frequency splitting. And then I'm going to save this rack group, and I'm just going to call this frequency bass rack, and then today's date is June 20th with a year, because you might not think so, but you'd be surprised how much the time goes by. I have stuff that's still saved from like 2014, so I'm just going to go here and drag it into my library on effect racks, or sorry, templates, and there we go. And here's all the basses that I've made that I've liked, which is actually not very much compared to, or considering how many basses I make on a day-to-day basis. But that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions about this stuff, then feel free to leave it in the comment section, or if there's something that I missed or something that you have to teach me, I would love to know, because this is kind of where my knowledge extends on how to treat basses and how to do stuff like this. And I hope that this is useful to you. So thank you guys so much for watching my content. This will be available on Patreon, and happy producing. I'm going to go play Bloodstained. Goodbye.